begin as always, Benum Christ in it. I agree, Christ in you, and I'm glad you could make it here this morning. It's nice to see you all back. I'll go ahead and share the screen as we begin. So let us pray. Abba God, I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will. I await your silent bidding, so that only your will be done in me. Whatever you do, I thank you. I accept all and I am ready for all. In your tender love, I offer the gift of my whole being. Help me to know the true freedom that arises from abandonment to your will. Help me to know the true freedom born of obedience to your divine love. Amen. So our first reading today comes from page 48, for those of you who have the book and would prefer to follow there. One can readily see a theology of dress reflected in the movement from stripping off the old self and being clothed with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. Interior freedom from the tyranny of the false self, i.e., the old self, leads to a spiritual renewal stripped of an egoic identification in the world, opening one to the deeper awareness of oneself as the image of God. Indeed, the Christian spiritual life is a process of stripping off the ego and exposing the false self, driven by fear, desire, lust, and competition. The remedy, as Paul admonishes, is to clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. But above all, he says, clothe yourself with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. As we will see, asceticism amounts to nothing if in the end it does not open us ever more deeply to the possibility of loving and being loved. So our second reading spans 48 and 49, chapter 2. With the renewal of the true self, the awakening of love for others, one can more clearly see the transient nature of social, cultural, and religious identity. Paul says, in that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free. But Christ is all and in all. As always, for Paul, this cannot remain a theoretical love of a hypothetical neighbor, but must be embodied most especially through forgiveness in the context of a living community. The fruit of these efforts is its own reward. What the ego once perceived as separation is now recognized as unity in the body of Christ. So it is with grace, we gradually discover that freedom is not freedom from God, but freedom from the domination and illusions of the false self. Unshackled from its demands, we uncover again our deepest identity as the image of God, the true self that increasingly reflects the love of Christ in the world. Not until one's ego is replaced with love for another does Christian ethics attain its perfect fulfillment. So our closing prayer this morning is brief. Lord Jesus, in your incarnate love and wisdom, teach me to love you and to live through you, with you, for you, and in you. Amen. So I open the floor to your questions. Carol?
Well, first like to announce that I'm an idiot. I've been hearing this stripping off your clothes for a while, and it just didn't connect. I mean, I thought of, the whole general image, but in your book, when you put in stripping something about fear, and since I've mentioned before that I'm driven by fear, it hit me that I've been asking God to heal my false self, which is ridiculous. You know what I mean? I was just so happy to be sitting in that image of letting go of that fear that I still cling to, but knowing that it's the false part of me. It's not the true representation of who I am in Christ. And that when I feel that fear in the future, to be able to say, it's not me, that's what I created to get through this world. It's false. And that go back to, like you said, the loving part of me and getting to know who I am in God. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. And you're not an idiot at all. It's interesting how often, even in my own life, I've had a sort of, I was interpreting certain words or ideas for the longest time in one particular way. And then through one sentence that I read in Merton or one of the Desert Mothers or Fathers, it's suddenly like, oh, now I see. And it's just so clear. So we've all had that experience, and I'm glad that that's helpful for you. So good. Okay, other comments or thoughts? Yeah, hi, Jennifer.
Hi. So forgive me because I'm not sure how articulate I'll be because I'm still trying to make sense of it all myself. So Carol, I totally hear where you're coming from. I guess I wonder if it's a couple things. If it's fair to say that for all of us humans, as we're going through our lives, whether or not we're on an intentional journey towards becoming one with Christ, are there moments in our lives when we, for whatever reason, grace of God, good night's sleep, all those things, that we are more free from our false self? It seems like that's probably true, even if we aren't on the intentional journey yet. And then two, what about all the sort of trickiness around the false self in its need for safety, acclaim, all those things, starts doing quote unquote good in the world? And what is that truly good? Or I mean, I understand there are people that do good and maybe there are other motivations and yet they've done some good. So does that make sense, Father Vincent? I'm trying to kind of get a handle on, I guess, how do we, maybe through prayer and discernment and wisdom, understand when we are free from our false self? When are we truly being loving, compassionate,
Right.
humble, all those things?
Yeah, no, those are some great questions. To the first question about, are we ever more, more free than less so, through a good night's sleep or grace or whatever that may be. One of the, I guess, ways I think about that is, well, first of all, the whole spiritual journey is messy. It's always messy. It's never linear, right? So all you have to do, I always love to harken back to the whole Exodus narrative and how Israel was just wandering all over the place throughout that desert. There was never a straight line. There were, up and down. And that, I think, is really sort of marking quintessentially the lack of linear direction of any spiritual life. But more immediately to your question, I think we encounter something of the rising up of the true self when we're lost in something. And that could be putting together model airplanes, or, if you can think through the experience of being on or really self-conscious versus really lost in something that you're deeply passionate about, I think there is a glimpse there of what when we are doing something that we enjoy. It doesn't have to be saving the world. It could be a hobby. It could be something that really just comes out from our creative side. I think there is a grace in that, and an experience or a glimpse of what it means to be living with a lack of self-awareness that is freeing. And often that'll sometimes joggers talk about the runner's high, or, those moments where you're in your zone. I think there is something of an analogy there to what that feels like to be really fully awake and alive and not self-conscious, precisely not self-conscious about it. There, I think we see those glimpses. Yeah. And I think too, it's always the case that no vocation is entirely pure, and we shouldn't expect it to be. I think there is indeed a psychological human need and desire for affirmation and for, I think you used the word accolades, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think what we can experience, though, is in the spiritual life, a growing ability to what Martin Laird talks about, of becoming aware of the awareing self, where you're like, you can begin to say, okay, I am aware that I have a certain psychological or emotional need to be affirmed in the work that I'm doing. And I actually appreciate that. And it motivates me, and it helps me know that I'm doing, going in the right direction. So that we don't have to measure our vocation by the level to which it causes us to suffer. I mean, on some levels, I think that one of the ways I think we can really discern our passion is, does this thing bring you to life? Does it give you life? Is it something you can get lost in? And that, to me, feels like where that sweet spot is between recognizing, yeah, I do have certain needs. This is a normal psychological, emotional thing to want and to need certain things. I remember many times as a very young man, virtually every spiritual director I spoke to cautioned me about a false assumption that there is such a thing as a pure vocation, and that you have to somehow find yourself in that and what your needs might be in that. And I think that's a perfectly healthy and wonderful thing to do. It's when those things are unconscious and become the driving motivators that we might find ourselves more getting into problems around going wayward, or losing our path, or turning something that originally is meant for the service of others in on oneself, and so forth. And these are things we can continually move in awareness through our meditation and just recognizing. But I think it's very fair and very safe and very healthy to honor the good that you see. Remember, I keep coming back to this notion of humility as being not, self-deprecation, but seeing the truth about yourself and admitting it. And that sometimes means admitting, I'm really good at this, and therefore follows an ethical demand. Well, then the community, needs it of you, so go do it, and do it well, and do it with joy. And so I think all of this becomes a healthy, integrated way, rather than one that tries to falsely make ourselves into martyrs, right? Where unless I'm miserable, something must be impure about this, and this can't be good for me, right? So I would say, find that thing you love, and then find a way to make it into a path that becomes your spiritual path.
Mm-hmm. And then can you just say, this is so helpful. when we are bumping into the false selves of others, I think for me, it's felt helpful to maybe not try to not be coming from a place of judgment, but from a place of understanding and compassion and acknowledging, wow, that's me most of the time as well. Can you say more about how to?
You mean like when we're able to recognize in ourselves like these consistent foibles?
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's so tempting to want to just focus on the other. So is the remedy really saying, oh, there I go again, and I could see myself doing the same thing? Or, for example, when we see a movement of people that are seeking justice or peace in the world, and yet there's all kinds of messiness about it, and even harm caused by some of aspects of the movement. How are we as contemplatives called to hold that and to also know that we have a log in our own eye and all of that? Does that make sense?
Yep, I do. In fact, it's interesting you're asking, as you'll see, the meditation I'm going to propose, the practice for this week, in a sense, addresses this very thing. I think a huge dose of humor is important to really look not only at my own, idiocy, stupidity, short-sightedness, repeated things that I just can't, ways of being that I just can't seem to free myself from. And to recognize how that plays out in every single person. And therefore, when the ego of an individual becomes a movement or becomes a communal expression, and what sometimes I've heard called as the we-go, right? So that there is that communal sort of sense. I do think that, compassion, humility, humor, all of that. And one of the things that, I think St. Paul talks about that's really helpful to remember is that whole thing about this thorn in his side, and how he says, please, remove this from me. I can't take this anymore. And God says, well, my grace is enough for you. So the question becomes, how did those very foibles become thresholds of grace? Not just something to resist, but really moments by which we can begin to recognize our utter dependency on grace. And to just be able to forgive ourselves in that, right? And say, somehow this thing that I think of as a thorn or a limitation or a foible can become, if I just open to it, also just another way in which God works through me. And part of that has to be laughing at ourselves and being willing to not take ourselves too seriously. Mm-hmm. And then to just, honestly, I think so often, because so many of these things are so particular, wound up in our own family history, or our own personality traits, or our own genetics, our own situation and culture. A lot of it is just feeling our way through that messiness without expecting a blueprint. You know what I mean? And just realizing we are all a mess. We really, really are. And yet grace abounds. So how does that happen? And so to rejoice in both of those things. And I think this is where community plays a huge role in our ability to guide us through this. Some, the anamkara relationship, the close friend who you can say, oh my God, I did that thing again. And them to say, just to remind you, yes, you are loved. Yes, you are silly. Yes, that's ridiculous. And it's okay. And somehow, grace continues to work. And acknowledging those things is the first step of not allowing them to continue to operate invisibly. So by exposing them, you've already taken tremendous steps to sort of diminish the capacity they might play in your life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful, Jen.
Oh yeah, I'm getting all teary. Thanks.
Yeah, good. That means it's okay. I'm glad to hear. Thanks. Okay. That's great. Joan, please.
Thank you. I have to think more about what you just said. I think you may have answered my question, but I'm not sure. I'll just say real quick, twice lately, and today was one of the times, I have seen a reference to the false self and to, that whole thing of wanting to not live in the false self. The word fear, God, I wish you would put fear in there, because it feels like, if I hear it, and I know I take things very literally sometimes, but I hear it as, if you were a better person, and you were more spiritually developed, you wouldn't be afraid. You know, and that's, it feels like I'm hearing, so you should stop doing that. You know, you should not be, and it's so human, and especially if you're afraid on behalf of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that wasn't in there. I mean, how are we judged for being afraid? No, that can't be.
No, right. And I think you're pointing to something, Joan, that's really important for us to remember, is that, you know, I think if, for whatever limitations we might ascribe to it, I think personality tools like the Enneagram, for example, which folks like Richard Rohr helped to popularize and so forth, do have a very general capacity to kind of help people identify with a certain place out of which a certain territory out of which we approach the world. And very often it just points to your orientation. For some people, you're just oriented to be fearful. There's just a certain cautiousness, you know, you could see. And in some ways, to be honest, I'm like that. I am a very hyper vigilant person. I could see a crisis coming a mile away. And I'm like, doesn't anybody else see that there's a catastrophe like right around the next corner and we have to be prepared? And so the point is, no, we obviously shouldn't beat, you know, ourselves into not being fearful or not being cautious or not being angry. I think part of it is to simply start where we are. And that's one of the beautiful things that if you really look seriously at things like the Enneagram, it doesn't try to say, oh, you have to stop being that person. But here's how you can take your general qualities, these orientations that for whatever reason are just part of your makeup. It's just part of who you are. And to be able to reorient those positively. So they talk about the redeemed and the unredeemed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever your number is, right? And the examples are, you know, the unredeemed is somebody who is fearful and is driven by fear and becomes reclusive, and their whole lives are kind of diminished because they have no capacity to leave their home or forge a relationship. And it doesn't have to be that way. That fear might not go away, but it can be transformed into something that both helps you transcend the possible limitations and actually make that fear something positive for you and others in your life. You know, a person who understands how to be cautious and how to help a community through a crisis or whatever the case may be. So I do think that self-awareness does not need to be followed by beating ourselves into some kind of submission around becoming perfect or ridding ourselves of that thing, as much as holding it gently, right? And honestly, and then saying, so what good can come of this? What does this personality trait I wish would go away, whatever my thorn in the side is, and how can this become a conduit of grace? How can this become an opportunity for me to really allow grace to be operative, not by denying, suppressing, or pushing it aside, but by really owning it in a new way. That's a very different dynamic because you're working with the energy rather than trying to resist it. It's almost like, you know, when you look at the way boxers in the West fight, you know, pushing against each other versus martial artists who learn to take the momentum and weight of your opponent and throw them over your shoulder. You use that momentum in your favor. That's a different approach to how to deal with these things that come up in us. And of course, that those, you know, other than speaking to that in the broadest of terms, it would take, I think, spiritual direction and real work on the individual's part to ask how that happens in their own life. But I do think it's very possible.
Yes, thank you. I do know that now that you say that. I mean, specifically with anxiety. Let me give people advice. If you have anxiety at a moment, don't try to fight it because you're focusing on it and you're making it more powerful. Better to accept that that's where I am at the moment and what happens next. What do I do next? Which is what I hear you saying. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think very often, you know, that's absolutely the case. If you can just be with it and just let it run its course, it's going to go away quicker than if you exhaust yourself fighting it. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Gerald, please. Gerald, would you just want to make sure? Yeah, there you go.
My turn?
Yes, please.
Father Vincent, is it fair to think of the ego self is part of what I would call the human condition, which I think of as a result of original sin? And we can't really shake the human condition. It's as God made us. But as we develop, and God knows that we're sincere in our efforts in our spiritual development, but God also knows that we're going to fall flat on our face. And we can't overcome the human condition because of the human condition. But we can continue to sincerely try to improve on it. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, no, Gerald, actually, it's a really good point. We'll actually address this when we get to asceticism in chapter 4. And one of the asceticism, of course, are those spiritual practices that we normally associate with developing virtue and sort of spiritual perfection, and I use that word in quotes very cautiously, where practices like fasting and vigil keeping and so forth, those types of things we associate with trying to unmoor ourselves from attachments and to live more freely. So when we look at asceticism as a spiritual practice, one of the things I want to lead us to in that chapter is an understanding that the very point of asceticism is to teach us to fail at it, right? Because it's the moment we really fail at our ascetical practices after the real hard effort of trying to be perfect, to do right, to avoid hurting people and so forth. When we realize, gosh, no matter how many times I start over, I end up back in this same ditch, or I end up making the same stupid mistake or whatever. It's when we realize that in our failure, it is indeed when Christ is triumphant in us. That we really then say, I can't, you must. And it becomes in that moment when we really realize I just can't save myself. No matter how hard I try, I can't do it. That is the first moment where we really begin to break open and realize, oh, wait a minute, I don't have to save myself. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to win the love of God. It is there in its abundance and working in and through me, even despite myself. And so you don't arrive at that deep, beautiful transformation or awareness by having a half-hearted attempt at it. You really have to try. And this frankly was Paul's entire spiritual journey to Christ. He was a Pharisee trying to save himself all his life, a beautiful, noble tradition in which he, every time he screwed up, he'd have to go back to the temple and sacrifice an animal or whatever he'd have to do to make himself right. And then I promise I'm never going to do this again. And then bam, he does the wrong thing, says the wrong thing, touches the wrong person at the wrong time, and he's right back in this impure state. And finally realizes, wait a minute, I don't have to save myself. That's been done. I can't save myself. I'm imperfect, and that's okay. So he encounters in Christ this tremendous love that frees him from the attempt to save himself. And his whole spiritual life becomes trying to explain that to people. If you look at Romans chapter 7, you will see one of the most beautiful expressions of Paul speaking exactly to what you're asking. So just read Romans 7 and you'll see exactly where Paul spells this out, not only for himself, but really for all of humanity. So it's about acknowledging we are loved. Yes, of course, we're trying to hit the bullseye. We don't want to turn our back to the bullseye because then we don't have any shot at it. But it's not about the perfection. It's about the attempts, and it's about the grace that guides us through it. Okay, so Sylvia, I'm going to respond to Sylvia's question, and then on the top of the hour, I'll move, for those of you who need to, I'm going to move to the practice, and I'll just ask whoever else has their hand up, in this case, Christina Paloma, just to hold tight for a couple minutes, and I'll come back to you for those who can stay. All right. So let's take one last question, and then I'll move to the practice for this week. So those who have to go will have an opportunity to. Sylvia, please.
Good morning. So something to share is that in developmental psychology and sociology and cultural anthropology, they're now positing that in addition to fight, flight, freeze, that there is another more present and more evolutionarily developed trait of befriend and tend. So when circumstances, either external or internal, arise that would previously have given a complete opening for fear to show up and a reaction of fight, flight, freeze, with a contemplative path, with a path of inquiry and more higher development as we evolve, befriend and tend. So when I first learned that, I really was so excited to realize, oh, I'm just not stuck in this false self, fight, flight, freeze. And for me, cultivating deep curiosity about the fear. What are you here in the room with me for? Come closer, sit. Would you like a cookie, cup of tea? I want to find out why you're here. What's your story? What information do you have to share? And most of all, I want the energy. That's my energy that you fear have claimed and hijacked, and I want it back. So that's my path, not always successful, but when I find fear arising, my first hope is that I can have an opening of compassion, curiosity, and deep invitation.
That's really beautiful, Sylvia. It reminds me, there is a sense in which the sort of inquiry and being with, rather than resisting, reminds me of this sort of martial arts analogy I gave. We were trying to work with that energy, but to really be present to it, it does take its own degree of courage. And I think very often the things that we in our tradition have come to call sin are actually products of our evolutionary development that were intended for survival. And I think fear is one of them. The question is, can we learn to rise above those evolutionary basic needs of, flight, or freeze, to something of a higher, love or contemplative mind rather than lizard mind, as it's been talked about, as sort of our ultimate evolutionary progress or goal. And while fear has indeed served us well, we don't want to just berate it, force it down, repress it, pretend it's not there. It has an evolutionary function. It's kept us alive. There are circumstances where fear is a really appropriate response to a circumstance. And when we should honor that, it's when and the way I often think is we want to, though, expand our psychological tool belt so that we don't overuse fear or anxiety or aggression or whatever as the only tool in every situation where, we're coming after everything, with a hammer, when sometimes all you really need is just a little, a screwdriver or something like this. So to be able to sit and inquire, who are you? Why are you here? What do you have to offer me? And hey, by the way, I want that energy back, is a really nice contemplative approach. It's beautiful. Thank you for that. Great wisdom there. Yeah. Okay, that brings us to the top of the hour. Let me just, I'm going to do a share screen then, and then we'll come back to the questions for those of you who still have your hands up. Practice for this week, it's a little bit long, and that's only part of it, as you'll see. So this is a long-winded way of giving you what is really a simple practice. So this week's practice is going to come to you in two parts. The first I'm going to explain right now, and the second I'm going to ask Robert to send out midweek, because I want to take you through it in two parts without giving you the whole thing up front. So to begin, the first part is to think of a person for whom you hold some animosity, anger, resentment. Right? I'm going to ask you as you think of them, not to attempt to forgive them, or certainly not to berate yourself when you can't or don't feel you're able to forgive them. Just hold them present in your consciousness throughout the week, whether that's in your prayer, in your thoughts, as you're driving, as you're doing mundane chores. Just keep recalling this person. Hold that gaze, right? Direct your thoughts to the person rather than their actions which hurt or betrayed you. And this is a very important piece. So just call the person to mind, their image, their face. Don't keep replaying in your mind the thing that they did that caused you harm or betrayed you. So do nothing more than hold them in this patient, contemplative gaze as often as you can, and let arise whatever arises. As you have thoughts, feelings, memories, rants, narratives, respond with your prayer word or your prayer phrase, and then just continue to hold them in that gaze. And somewhere around Wednesday, the rest will follow. And that's where I'll ask you to take a step beyond that, okay? So just, I want you to call to mind a person with whom you've held or hold animosity without attempting to forgive them or berate yourself for not being able to. Just hold them, their face, their image, as narratives which repeat the offending moment or which goes on rants about what you'd like to say or do, thoughts about revenge or anything like that. As those arise, just come back to your prayer word and just let the gaze on that person hold your consciousness as often as you can. And on Wednesday, check back your email and I'll have by then Robert send out what I'd like you to do next. Okay. All right, I see some questions coming in. I'm going to stop share then for a moment. Let's see. That's, oh, okay. So that was some other items going on. Okay, so let me just ask, are there any questions about what I'm asking there? Okay. So for those of you who need to go this morning, Benum Christinet, I bless you this week. I hope you have a lovely week. For those who can stay, I hope that's the bulk of you. We'll answer these last three questions. We'll end with Mary, and then we'll begin a brief conversation around our practice from last week, as has become our tradition. So just three more questions on content, and then I'll go again. I'll share screen so we can look at last week's practice and open up some dialogue there. So Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you. So since fear has been such a major part of today's sharing, I wonder if you might talk about holy fear and perhaps how we can hold the two together to get to a better place. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, Christine, that's a great question. You know, so many times in the Old Testament, particularly in places like the Psalms, we see things like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there's a lot of struggle people have with that idea because we don't want to fear God. We want to have an intimate relationship, and that's difficult to, you know, there's multiple things being called upon. Then how do I have this intimate divine human relationship with God who I'm supposed to, you know, approach first and foremost as something to be afraid? There's multiple ways I think of thinking through this. The example I normally think of around this is the difference between our experience of the ocean from being on the beach, on a beautiful sandy beach on a tropical island with the waves lapping at our ankles, as opposed to being like in the middle of the night, in the middle of the Pacific, totally alone, you know, with miles of ocean dangling beneath our feet, which is an absolutely terrifying experience of the same body of water, right? It's the same body of water. It's just where we find ourselves in position. There's a beautiful line in Hebrews that says it's a terrifying thing to find ourselves in the hand of God. And I think that in many and myriad ways that we try to domesticate God, making God something that is not to be feared is really among them. I don't think it's fear in a way that we would fear, a prowling lion in the jungle, but there is this terrifying immensity, the way an ocean, being lost in the middle of an ocean, which is, beautiful, right? If you saw a photograph of that ocean and you were safely, in your home, just looking at this beautiful image of the Pacific Ocean, you'd say, oh, that's beautiful. But if you were really alone out there, totally in the middle of it and being consumed by it, it would be horrifying. And I think that there is room in our theology for not shying away from this notion of God and being caught up in a divine embrace as being terrifying spiritually and otherwise, because of the immensity of love, the immensity of mercy, the immensity of infinity. Floating out in space with nothing to cling to. I mean, it's a terrifying idea, but yet space itself is absolutely a beautiful phenomenon, right? So I think if we are able to sort of split the hair between fear and being afraid, and really understanding that in this sense, that fear is this tremendous sense of awe around the immensity of the divine and our relative comparative nothingness or poverty. I do think much can come of this. And what can come of it, I think, is freedom, right? Because we can't have God in our hip pocket. We can't have a God that we can domesticate and cosify and in a sense, make our pet thing. There is always a degree. And part of what I tried to play with in our prayers today is to understand submission and obedience as true freedom, because otherwise we're under the tyranny of all those things that would otherwise control us, our fears of other things and so forth. So I think it's truly almost a theological discipline in itself to explore what we mean when we talk about an association of God and fear. But I think to try to domesticate or eliminate it is a mistake, because it diminishes the immensity, the incomprehensibility of something that by that nature in itself is awe-inspiring and even terrifying, right? But where we go from there, I think, is not, groveling, before God, like Jonathan Edwards' idea of sinners in the hands of an angry God. The fear is not fearing a wrathful God as much as the immensity of love and what that love means and how that love purifies and transforms. It's been said, we've talked about in the past how the Pietà is sort of what was always in the stone that Michelangelo uncovered. He didn't assemble the Pietà, he merely removed the chunks of marble to reveal what in a sense is under there. One might say that chunk of marble feared the hammer, that he was using to bang away, and that to that marble it would feel like punishment and pain, right? But in fact, it was this beautiful hand of the artist revealing this beautiful inner piece of what we now call the Pietà, the beautiful art of that. So fear becomes relative, I think, in that sense. I don't know if that's an answer or at least a reasonable response, but that's how I try to think through those things. Yeah. Paloma, please.
Oh, thank you. I feel like this is one of those weeks when every word is just sort of hitting the bone marrow. I just want to say thank you for this theme. And so this may not be a super clean question, but it feels like there's a hot seat that I'm needing to respond from. So this week I've been starting this chaplaincy, working with people who are in some cases dying or having serious conditions in a hospital setting. And And I also had my first overnight. And when I went on the overnight, I was told that the floor where we were supposed to sleep, until you're called, and then this sort of adrenaline surges through you and you have this fear rushing, and then you go to the side of somebody who's afraid, and then you're in a hospital that feels rather fearful. But I just wanted to sort of have a moment of sort of self-compassion. So I was afraid to go to the place where we were supposed to sleep because I was told that that floor is haunted. And the security guard, the first security guard, wouldn't walk with me there, and also said it was haunted. And when the alarm went off in the middle of the night, I went out to and I was a bit sort of in sort of that half sleep, and this door opened up, and I was told there were no other doors on this, no one else up there. And a body came out and walked down the hallway. And it turned out that the day before they had created an anesthesiology restroom as well. So there was this other person coming out that I was told would not be there. So anyway, the layers of fear, I guess I'm saying sort of that fear that the alarm goes off and your body is just kind of responding, at 3 a.m, that layer of fear. Then there's the layer of fear of these illusory, stories of, the place is haunted, fears, kind of wading through that. Then getting to this bedside of someone. And I think what struck me was my fear of the medical system and the medicalization. And what struck me was I was having trouble getting to the eyes and being of this being who is terrified of what they're going through, because I myself was looking at all these tubes and beeps and machines that they were plugged into and saying, oh my God, what has our healing system come to in this? So that it was my own fear around this medicalization that made it hard to even get to the being who was afraid of their liver and kidney collapsing and they're facing hospice. So I guess it's some question about how to get to the right level of fear through the sort of other superficial fears that are sometimes surrounding. And I guess also just wanting help with this fear about the election coming up and just what our country is facing and how do we turn it around, just the bigger social sphere. So
Thanks.
it's just a little messy pile of how do we sort through our various fears and know on which level to act in the midst of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Paloma. I think you, in your first instance about being on the haunted floor, you, in some ways, you responded to your own question in that you did work through it and you were able to realize, oh wait, these projected fears of ghosts or somebody walking down the hallway that you might assume, wait, that's an apparition because nobody's supposed to be up here or whatever. You already began to do that work of saying, oh, these are projections of fears about the medical system, about fears of death, about fears of being, terminal, and how those things get manifested either mythically or through stories of hauntings or whatever the case may be. All of these are really coming in to address those deeper fears, and indeed they can become entangled. I think in many ways what Sylvia was talking about earlier is really a way to do that very thing, to be able to sit with the fear, right, over tea or whatever the case may be, and say, so what are you doing here? What purpose do you serve? What is that energy about? What are you really trying to communicate? I think that's a beautiful exercise that would really respond to your question fully. I think and again, it goes back to what I said earlier in my first response, because so often these things are so nuanced and have to do with such particular circumstances. It would be almost impossible to provide a response to that other than a way to approach it, right? A way being sitting with, observing, acknowledging, honoring the fear, and trying to determine what purpose it's serving. In terms of, fears of the election, I know that, regardless of what side of the aisle people are on in this country, this is, there's tremendous anxiety going around our country now around the outcome of this election. I can only say that in the end, one of the things we profess is the God is the Lord of history and will remain such. And we have to hold on to that faith and to that grounding throughout the vicissitudes of political ups and downs and ebbs and flows and political tyrants and liberators. All of this is back and forth. And when you look even at the history of Israel in the Old Testament, my goodness, we see Israel has gone through far more dramatic swings and devastations. And yet there remains that consistent faith that carries them through. So I would say, as those fears arise, just continue to ground yourself in a God who is much bigger than someone we can domesticate nationally or otherwise, and just know that that the plan will unfold. There's a beautiful prayer we pray at the opening of our Celtic liturgy: "Carry out in tranquility your plan of salvation." So we trust that God is carrying out in divine tranquility the plan of salvation, and regardless of the outcome, we hold tight to that. And then we do our best to work for the social change that we desire. So, okay, Mary, please.
Good morning, Father Vincent and everybody. Thank you so much for your beautiful talk. I've traveled miles away from my original questions. So I'll go back and see if I can gather my words again. It was about false identities, back to Paul, and the question about the false identities that are connected to our false self, and like race, religion. And what I am experiencing, I connect a lot to listening to spirit and ways in which I need to go in my life. And what I'm becoming aware of is as I attempt to leave these false identities that are often attached to my family, my siblings, my legacy, I feel a sense almost of abandonment, that I'm abandoning these identities as I move to transcend. So I just wanted to make that comment, that's kind of the messiness that I experience. And the second comment I wanted to make was about confession, that as you were talking about, our need to be perfect and to come back to perfection. I mean, that was rooted in me when I was 6, when, every Saturday I went to confession and I had to scrutinize my 6-year-old behavior to become perfect. So that was the other comment I wanted to make. And thank you so much.
Sure, Mary. So I'll, if you'll allow me, I'll offer just a brief sort of response. The idea of perfection, the word that we see in especially Luke's gospel, where Jesus says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect," feels like such a condemnation, because it's how do you live up to that? How do you do that? But the word there really is telos, which is a Greek word which ultimately means the end, but it means the end in terms of a fulfillment, not a termination. I mean, yes, it means a termination, but not. It means more the end goal is maybe a way of thinking about it, the ultimate goal of oneself. So what's really being said there by using the word telos is become your true self, become all that you were meant to be, right? Fulfill the destiny of who you are, not to be perfect in a sense of flawless. And I think it was either George Maloney or Merton who pointed out years ago in one of their books that I read, that beautiful idea that I think I've mentioned, so I'll just reiterate it briefly, how there is no such thing as a perfect pine tree that every other pine tree tries to conform to, but every pine tree in its own uniqueness is a perfect pine tree. And that's telos. That's what it means. Not that you should zip on some suit to conform to some idea of perfection, but that rather you should become most fully who you are and who you are destined to be. And there's that notion of destiny and freedom that are so beautifully united, where to follow one's destiny does not inhibit our freedom, but is the expression ultimately of our freedom, right? So to fulfill our destiny in terms of our providential destiny is not to conform to something outside of ourselves, but to actually continue to grow more fully who we already are, to become more deeply who we already are. And that's, I think, the perfection that Christ is calling us to in that text, which is why the word there is telos. It's a very unique and different word than the type of Platonic perfection where Plato would say there's this perfect world of forms like a circle, and you have to now create that perfect circle, which is all but impossible. Even though you can imagine it, you cannot ultimately recreate it. It's not that kind of perfection. It's the perfection that comes from being most authentic to yourself. And that's going to mean something different for all of us, just like it means something different for the trees outside our windows.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, Mary. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move to a discussion about practice for those, again, who've asked me to do that. Martha and Gerald, I'll ask you guys, and Robin, I'll ask you just to keep your hands up for the time being, and time permitting, we'll come back. I know we may be up against a time crunch, so just leave your little blue hands up. We'll talk about practice now, and I'll be happy to address your questions after that. This way, for those people who would like to talk about practice before the end, we'll have a chance to do that. So let's look at last week's practice. This is, or actually what I guess now was 2 weeks ago. So explore what rituals you have developed as part of your meditation practice. The prayers you say, a place you go, a shawl you wear, beads you hold, a posture you assume, a bench or pillow or chair you sit upon. And meditate on each of these externals that inform the way you pray. What does it say about you? What does it say about your practice? And what does it say about your God? So you have the floor. Those of you who already have your hands up, just go ahead and bust in.
I'll bust in.
Okay.
Father Vincent?
Yes.
I really, really loved this exercise. And when you announced it to us, I instantly knew where I was going with it. And for the weeks, it was wonderful to look at it more deeply. And where I went to immediately is that for 50 years, when I meditate, I sit cross-legged. And I have been in large auditoriums of people sitting in chairs with their feet on the ground, and I stick my feet up on the chair. And I have felt sometimes self-conscious about this, but I do it because it instantly takes me to a deep place of heart, goodness, and love. And it begins my meditation in a place where if I didn't do it, I'd have to work to get to this place. And I went into my room where I have decades of paraphernalia from many different meditation exercises and ashrams and zendos and trips to India. And I touched and remembered with joy many of these experiences and these icons that I have with me that I have used over the years, but the simplicity of just sitting and going to my breath and my word is all that I need. And it took me to a place of my God and me being simple together. And I love that.
That's beautiful, Robin. Two things that come to mind as you're sharing that is the whole value of body memory, muscle memory, as they call it sometimes. That, you know, one of the values of having a discipline, for example, a prayer posture, cross-legged or legs, you know, feet up, whatever the case may be, whatever that may be, is that it signals to your body, oh, I'm doing that thing now. I'm doing that thing I call meditation or prayer or centering. And it really does help to train your muscles, your body to move into the place, right, that of meditation or quiet or centeredness. And I believe it was Catherine of Siena who said, in prayer, take that posture that most moves you to love. And that is exactly what I heard you saying in that there is a posture that really does help you to come to that place of love. So I think you've come to her insights and you're intuitively on your own. And we may have lost you there for a little bit. I'm not sure were you able to hear me, Robin?
No, but I'll get it on the tape. You froze for me for a little bit.
Okay, yeah, please do it. Otherwise, we can talk later too.
Yeah.
I'll share that with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So did anyone else want to share about your practice?
I'll share, Father Vincent.
Oh, sure. Hi, Wanda.
Okay. I am just learning about the contemplative practice, but some things that I've always done for 30 years, I realize are some parts of the practice. I always pray with a prayer shawl, but not because it's a prayer shawl. I like to feel that I have a way of managing external distractions. And so when I cover up, it helps me to manage external distractions, because my children were really little, when I really got serious about praying in time with God. And it was hard to keep my little one entertain herself. So when I wrap myself up and she'd come in the room, she says, "Oh, Mommy's praying." And so that helped her to honor my time. And so that's one reason that I do. And I'm like the sister before, I cross my legs. I don't know if that's because I was an educator who sat on the floor with kids, and teaching or my children, but I sit down and cover myself up and just and have my prayer time, and I just feel like I'm closed in, and I just have always loved that feeling of being closed in when I pray. So thank you for this time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for sharing that so openly. I agree with you in that, well, first of all, it's not even a question of agreeing. I honor the fact that you have that deep sense of your connection to that prayer shawl and what that actually means for you. A few paragraphs ago, I talked a little bit about the monastic cowl, which is a gigantic robe that they cover themselves with, and it's hooded. And when they put that hood up, I think it has that same idea that it's this way of which we cover ourselves as a way of almost cocooning, right? It's a cozy sort of intimate thing. And that you're able to have sort of intuited that for yourself, that this is really a time for you to turn inward, to really become introspective, and that your prayer shawl helps you to do that, I think is a lovely practice. And I would encourage, there was a beautiful series of books by Edward Hayes a number of years ago that he published, all different books of prayer. And he has one called Prayers for a Planetary Pilgrim, I think is the title. And he talks about having a special corner in a special room and with a prayer robe or a shawl to kind of, again, sort of that body memory, to tell ourselves we're moving into this space and to let the world know this is my little hermitage. I'm kind of closing in on that, and I need that space right now. And it's a beautiful thing. I love the idea of that text where Elijah, is listening through the earthquake and the fire and the wind, and then he hears this still small voice, and he immediately puts up his hood and goes to the mouth of the cave. There's that sense of now turning to that sacred space. So I would encourage that for all of you to find that for yourselves. It's why we have such a long monastic tradition of the use of cowls, because I think there's a deep ritual connection there of intimacy. Thanks, Wanda. Anybody else want to share their practice or their rituals or what that means? Sylvia, please.
Well, I realize I love this exercise, and I realize that it really depends on what is happening in my life, the place and the form of my meditation. And if it's a normal daily practice, I have this one favorite spot. And if the weather's beautiful, I have this one spot outside, and I love it's nobody can see me, and I'm all tucked away, and it's just me and nature. And but then I realized in examining this that when everything is falling apart, I mean, we are talking, earthquake, wind, fire. It depends on what's happening, but there's a spot on Mount Tam that I've only gone to maybe 5 or 6 times, and I go with a water bottle and a blanket, and I tell God, okay, I'm going to stay here until I get direction or guidance. I am not moving. I am going to sit here. If I have to spend the night and the rangers come, I don't care. I am not moving. And so there's that level. And then another one where I was going through a very, very, everything was going on, and I couldn't, this way, that way, oh my gosh. So I propped up all the icons, everybody. I mean, Jesus, Kuan Yin, Mary, Buddha, everybody was all in a row. And for several days, I would go and just, okay, I'm calling out everybody here. I really need help. And for the last time I did this, I was sitting there trying to get quiet, and I heard distinctly, all right, Sylvia, we've heard you. We got your prayer. Just be patient. For God's sakes, quit filling up our inboxes with this.
And prayer answered?
Yes, it was. But it was pretty, anyway, it just cracked me up.
That's awesome. It's one of the reasons that in Orthodox churches, they have what's called the Iconostasis, which is all the host of angels and saints and everybody you can imagine all surrounding the church. So even if you're there alone, you're surrounded by all the saints throughout the ages. And there's that sense of really calling on the whole company of heaven, as it were.
Right. One little angel won't do. I need a platoon.
That's right. I need a chorus. Thank you. That's awesome. Christine, please.
Oh, well, I'll just share this, that we have a good friend, and he was telling me that one of the reasons he really likes to come into my house is that in every room I have a picture or something of Jesus. I was kind of taken aback. I didn't realize that, but it is true. And one of the things I think that does is that then when I go outside, I'm so used to the physical presence of the holy that I wonder if it doesn't help me see that wherever I am. I just throw that out as something I just realized.
Absolutely, Christine. I think one of the beautiful things, at least I can speak for the Anglican tradition. I mean, I know in the Orthodox, the Catholic, certainly, these so-called sacramentals, icons, crosses, holy water, all of these things, there's so much in the world pressuring us to forget, to live unaware, to live asleep, to not wake up, that we shouldn't be afraid to have these markers, we're physical, we're incarnate, to have markers, icons, a cross in your pocket, whatever it is, that just helps us remain grounded in that, what Brother Lawrence called the practice of the presence of God. And I think your intuition may indeed be right, that when you're so infused and surrounded by the holy, then it's easier to carry that with you, so that you live in remembrance and not in forgetfulness throughout the day. And that's indeed what our whole meditative or prayer practice is about: just remembering what is, not living half asleep, but fully awake, or as awake as we can be. So thank you. It's beautiful. I think you're onto something there. Nora, I see your hand up. I just see a couple folks right before you, so I'm going to call on you right after Paloma. Okay, thank you for raising your hand. I'll remember it's up. So Ruth, Paloma, and then Nora.
I've loved listening to everybody else because I understand even more about my practice from things that people have shared. I started my practice years and years ago, before I knew about the false self or anything like that. But I did it because I traveled a lot for work. I traveled internationally. And I knew early on that in order to do what I did well, I had to get myself out of the way. And so at first I had this little portable altar that I had all bagged up in this wonderful little bag I got in Japan, and I'd lay everything out. But that didn't work for me because I needed to be able to pray in airports. I needed to be able to pray in an auditorium before a presentation. And Thich Nhat Hanh has, one of the things he talks about in one of his books is meditation is like being a pebble and sinking down to the bottom of the ocean. Mm-hmm. And I picked up a stone somewhere and I carried that stone. And I never realized until I listened to you talking about the icons and everything, that stone grounded me. That stone was like a posture. It was like an icon. It just pulled me into that holy space so that I could do my sit, so that I could get myself grounded. And the wonderful thing about it is periodically through the years, I lose these stones because I carry them everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they'll fall out of my pocket, or I'll take them out of my pocket and hold them in my hand, set them down and lose them. It doesn't even have to be the same stone. It is just that process. And you ask what it said about us and our God. What it says to me is that God is so intimately with us everywhere and in everything. And the stone for me for the last 5 or 6 years does not so much equate to sinking to the bottom of the ocean as I am holding the cosmos in my hand when I hold that stone, and it centers me and it focuses me. So thank you for this practice. I really liked it.
Oh, good. Thank you. That's a beautiful share, Ruth. I really appreciate your walking us through that. Beautiful. And I think indeed you've nailed it. There is, again, that sense of connection we have, from these deep symbols. I know somebody years ago who was wrongfully imprisoned for many, many years until DNA exonerated him. It was just a horrific case of a young man who spent way too many years of his youth in prison for no reason. And he carries a stone in his pocket. And he said, I hope before I die, I've worn this stone down to nothing. And I said, well, why do you carry it? He says, because it reminds me that as long as I'm holding it, I'm not throwing stones and judging someone else. I thought that was profoundly beautiful, because if anybody had a right to be angry at the system stole this man's life for almost 20 years, and the best of his life, his youth. And how he's turned his life around, and how he's turned this into, this is a man, when he got out of jail, he went to the president of Santa Clara University and said, here's my story. I want to go to college now. And the president said, how can I help you? He says, I need a free ride. and they gave it to him. And he became just an amazing student. And now he's a politician fighting for the end of death penalty and so forth, and for prison reform. So it's amazing how, and I know this man carries the stone because it reminds him not to throw, not to judge. So that's always a reminder that he's not judging. And man, I'm like, if anybody has a right to judge, this guy got just screwed over. So beautiful story. So these things can become deeply integrated into our spiritual practices, and how we do. There's a lot of freedom within the tradition to do these things, to really explore what works for me and what is the saying about my theology. So you've done that beautifully, Ruth. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, Paloma, and then we're going to come back to Nora.
Thank you. So I have a spiritual friend, and when we get together, we say a kind of prayer series, and we've been kind of developing this over time, and it's evolved now to where it's kind of a mantra, and there are 5 different stages of it. And as a result of this, Dennis has made a little mala, so that it has these 5 beads on it, or it's like a rosary with 5 little decades in it. And so now we share this with other people, and it's always a giveaway, but it's, the first is, I give thanks for the life in me. I give thanks for the life in you. I give thanks for the life between us. I give thanks for this world around us. And then I give thanks for the great mystery which holds all of us. So it's these 5 layers, and we have 5 beads for each one with a little, it's sort of like we made up our own rosary and grew out of a sort of lived practice. And I think the power of that was like, wow, we can do this. This is, we can actually invent our own thing that grew out of something that is alive between us. And then we use that when we're apart, in our daily lives. It's just like one of those little prayer bead bracelets. It's kind of hidden, but the fact that the 5 colors change, we know what it means. And then we've also put it up on the web. So anyway, I can send that. I just got a chat request about that. So happy to share, because Dennis actually wrote up the prayers that we've been kind of evolving on that. And so it's, for me, it helps to have something in my hand, like we were just hearing from Ruth. And this is sort of a little, goes from the inside to you, between us, the world, and then the great mystery, God.
That's right. Beautiful, Paloma. And yes, indeed, I do think, any prayer or ritual worth its weight is one that's going to be authentic and not rote. But you can see that one of the things I love about the Anglican communion of churches is there's this sense in which we kind of hold the basics, like say in our liturgical practice, we hold the basics as being essential, but then there's a certain degree of latitude in how those get expressed on the local level, because ritual really does have to come out of the local experience to be authentic. It's very hard to import ritual and have it really make sense. There has to be a certain enculturation, for example. And then of course, I think the same is true then on the personal level. So, look at, for example, your point about wanting to have something tangible to hold, the beads in this case. Virtually every tradition, religious tradition, has some form of prayer beads. In fact, beads comes from the Anglo-Saxon bidden, which means prayer. So there's a real association between the beads and the bidding, the prayer itself. And if you look up, for example, the Anglican rosary, there's many different options for what's given that can be used on those beads, rather than something that's determined as the universal way of praying that. And then from there, you can open up to again, inviting your own. So a practice of gratitude that you talked about speaks in a unique way to the heart of what Christian faith is about, which is Eucharisto, right? Gratitude. That is the fundamental posture of the Christian toward the world, is a Eucharistic posture, a posture of utter gratitude. And so the fact that you've intuited that in this prayer beads, I think, is both personal, but also really connecting beautifully to the tradition. Nicely done. Okay, and that brings us to Nora, and then we'll return to Martha and Gerald, because I know you had some questions, I think, more about theme and content. So we'll close on the practice question with Nora, and then go from there. Sorry for the wait.
I I just wanted to say that I meditate in bed, covered up really securely, and it helps me to just forget comfort. I mean, I'm just comfortable, and so that helps me. But I have a folk art crucifix near my bed, and it's from Mexico, and it has a fat Jesus on the cross, and always, somebody this week said, to start your day by saying, "Good morning, Jesus." And it's really easy to say, "Good morning, Jesus," to my crucifix, that with the fat Jesus kind of there. He's very personal to me. And so I say that, "Good morning," and then I put on a sleep mask, and that image kind of stays with me, and I just go to my place for meditation. So the humor is there, but also the kind of giving of myself to the little fat Jesus that hangs above my bed. So that's kind of my practice.
I love it. I love it. I really think we have lost humor in our spiritual life. We don't claim it enough. We don't recognize enough. We don't celebrate it enough. We talked about earlier about laughing at ourselves. That is really a practice right there, to just be able to say, "Oh my God, I am ridiculous," right? I am just ridiculous. But also to have this beautiful image of like this fat Jesus, as you're calling it, as sort of your way of, divine humor. I often in my classes spell out to my students as we're studying the Gospels, places where I think we might rightly be reading the evangelists writing humor. We don't think that they were attempting to be humorous at times, but I think they absolutely were. And if you can see them, sometimes they're not told in the way that we might express humor today, but if you can really imagine the scene, they're ridiculous. Some of the things are just absolutely absurd. And quite funny. Luke, I think, takes the cake most of the time and things like this. So I love that you're incorporating this sort of sweet humor into your prayer as a start to the day. That's lovely. A lesson to be learned for all of us. Thanks, Nora.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. I do want to honor, I know Martha and Gerald will keep them as the last questions because we're coming up again on the hour. But we'll start with Martha, and I'm sorry for the wait to both of you. Martha, by all means, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, I didn't know I left my hand up the whole time. Can I quickly comment on a practice?
Oh, sure, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, interestingly, I have mala beads, which I just love. I don't usually use them for prayer or meditation. Once in a while I do when I feel called to that. But interestingly, I don't know where I had heard this, but I did try it and it was wonderful. I did the Jesus prayer using the mala beads, which was very nice. It was a wonderful experience. And then funny enough, through Seasons of Creation and the global Catholic climate movement, with the rosary beads, they did an earth prayer. So it was very different because it was, you were doing prayers to the earth. I don't usually pray the rosary, but I said, well, I'm going to jump in and try new things here. And again, it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It was very different than the traditional rosary. And then one of my cousins several years ago went to Cuba, where my parents are from. I've never been there, and my parents have been here, for many, many years. I was born in the United States. But she brought me back stones from Cuba. And on the altar that I have, I did a cairn. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. And I built a little cairn with the stones from Cuba. And as a usual practice, when I step out first thing in the morning to walk my dog, I will usually turn east where the sun is rising, and it grounds me very interestingly in the day, but to the earth, when I just say, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." So it's very, because hearing all of the comments, I can kind of, I resonated with just about what everybody said, of, just the wonderful variety of practices that, we can pick and choose and do with however we feel called to embrace our relationship, with God. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Martha.
Thank you for everyone sharing. That was wonderful. Okay, prior to that, my question on when we were talking about fear, and I thought, is there perhaps within us, within myself, a fear of maybe truly being more Christ-like or God-like, more of our true self, simply because of the level of openness and trust that implies, and perhaps the responsibility that comes along with that. And I think about that because sometimes I think about the life of Jesus and the human Jesus, and I think from such a young age, that level of openness and awareness and trust where you heal, and you obviously have a certain energy to heal, because I think of the story when the woman touched him and he turns around and he says, and he's in a crowd and he says, "Who touched me? I felt my energy leaving me." Walking on water, things like that, where you're elevated to this level, to this, this is the divine aspect of Jesus now that we're talking about, but also to the point that you're willing to be that open and to take along the responsibilities and the consequences of what that entails.
So thank you for the question. I think one of the reasons that we prefer to have Jesus a hero figure who is out there, up there, and over there, rather than recognizing we are extensions of Christ in the world, is precisely hinges on that fear of what that would imply if we accepted the grace and the truth of what the incarnation has transformed us into. And I think you've really nailed that very resistance we feel. What would our lives look like as we more and more come to the realization that we are other Christ, that we are members of Christ's body and so forth, not just in terms of the intimacy, which is of course attractive and beautiful and so forth, but in terms of now what? What does that demand of me to really be Christ for others, and what must die in me that Christ might rise in me? These are precisely the reasons why we feel so, I think, resistant to the idea of deification, even as we're drawn to it. In Rudolf Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy, he has that beautiful phrase that God is the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that is once fearful and fascinating. So we're both drawn and repulsed at the same time. We want to run because it's terrifying, and yet we're so enamored. And I think that translates into who we are as members of Christ's body when we begin to realize the effectual nature of the incarnation in terms of our own deification. As we move through the book, Martha, we'll be actually exploring that very thing, that both the resistance and the draw that meet us at the same moment. And that's a universal, I think, experience. Thank you for that. Thanks for your comment and your question. Okay, and then lastly, Gerald, please.
I just wanted to share a couple of things real quick, Father. for those of us who are unorthodox, I haven't really been able to develop any kind of a set ritual. In fact, I've had the thought that that's nuts, that stuff came out of the monasteries, and these men and women had very set times and places and rituals, but my life doesn't go that way. We had 5 children, and today it's still catch as catch can, I'm afraid. Oh, I have, I have one of those little tiny round rosaries with 10 beads and a crucifix on it that I carry in my pocket, but it's not something I grab frequently. If I'm on a walk, I might say the rosary on my fingers, but it's still, I don't have a special place, a special time, a special icon. Now, my wife leans more that way, and that leads me to the second thing, which ties in with what Sylvia mentioned, and that is there is a Christian meditative approach to dealing with some of these things called the welcoming prayer. And I wish my wife was with us today, but she's in a retreat, a silent retreat today, interspersed with Zoom sessions. And I don't think I'm allowed to speak to her until about 6 o'clock this evening. But in fact, she conducts the welcoming prayer. But it focuses right on those things of befriending those things, welcoming them. And it works well. In fact, she was invited to go down to a correctional facility, prison in Florida, and I went and sat with her, and the guys responded very well. It was interesting, but amen.
Cheryl, thank you for that. I'll point out a couple of things. You really speak to a very important piece, which my book and my community that I founded, both New Skellig and what I try to inculcate now at St. Columba's, is that if indeed it is true that the contemplative life is a universal call for all Christians, well, we could broaden that to all people, but let's stick to our own tradition for a moment. If the contemplative life is not just a special life for some people, but is the pinnacle of human prayer, of Christian prayer, then in some sense, we have to understand contemplative practice as a universal call, of which monasticism is only one way of responding. I think very often what happens is we put ourselves under just this tremendous, unrealistic pressure to become literally monks in the world rather than contemplatives in the world. And by that, I mean, to affirm the conundrum of saying, I don't have the luxury to spend, get called to prayer 7 times a day with my brothers or sisters and meditate on the Psalms. Like, I'm a father of 5 kids, and I've got a home, and I've got now potentially grandchildren, whatever the case may be. That's not my life. My book is designed precisely to respond to that question, not to provide or suggest a retrofit or watered down form of monasticism, but to continually ask the question, what does the contemplative life look like for the Christian living in the world? And that means, while we can certainly hold out certain very basic principles, a regular attending to silence, and regular doesn't have to mean every day. Maybe regular means for you 2 or 3 times a week, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, when you're not doing whatever you're doing on Tuesday, Thursday, that really takes your time. Anecdotally, I remember shortly after my niece was born, my sister was breastfeeding, and it was during Lent. And she was complaining to me. She said, with the kids now, it's her second child. And of course, a new infant is very demanding. And she's sitting there on a couch breastfeeding. I'm sitting in the room with her, and we're talking. And she says, I just don't know what I'm going to do for Lent. I've got so many responsibilities with the girls, and I feel guilty because I just don't have time to really pray and to do all this. I finally said to her, Palma, as we speak, you are giving life to your child. Right? You are sitting there for 20 minutes at a time as your very body gives life to her. Isn't that a Lenten practice? Isn't that what dying to oneself to give life to another is about? I mean, your entire life revolves around this 8-pound little thing, this little child, right? That demands everything. That's your practice right now. To be attentive, to do that with great intention, not to think you have to do something else in addition to that, but to do what you're already doing with deeper, centered, prayerful attention, to see that as life-giving, as prayerful, as contemplative. If you're breastfeeding multiple times a day at 20-minute sits or whatever, allow yourself just to enjoy the beauty of that intimacy you're building with your own child, of what your body is capable of doing that I can't do, that your husband can't do, but you can, and you are. And so I want to invite us, based, Gerald, on what you're sharing, to think, at least in large part, of what we do in the contemplative life, not as doing one more thing, but start where you're at. What are you doing? And how can you do that more prayerfully, with greater awareness, with deeper gratitude, with more careful attentiveness? Perhaps the welcoming prayer is a way to do that. And if that works, fantastic. Just basically accepting what is in the moment and giving yourself to it fully. That's a start, and that's enough. Things from there will follow. And as we move through life, from starting to build a career and a family to, rearing children, ultimately to retirement, things are going to change. Things are going to look different for us, and that's okay. For contemplatives in the world, we have to understand there is no contemplative life separate from what we're doing. It's about doing what we're doing contemplatively, and that's going to require a tremendous amount of flexibility. And let's not put ourselves under the mistaken notion that we have to do what monastics do. There is no doubt that is a beautiful response and call to the contemplative life, but it is not the only one, right? And so I just would invite you, Gerald, over the next several weeks to not feel like you have to do anything other than ask, how is what I'm already doing? How can I do it more with deeper awareness, with greater prayerfulness, with more love, with more acceptance, and then see what begins to emerge out of that. Does that help you a little bit, to give you a different perspective? All right, yeah, start with that and then see what they get you.
Yes,
all right.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good, all right. Okay, I've seen some of the thoughts come through. So thank you, Ruth and Dwight and all of you for that. And Carol, somebody just wrote, who was it? Oh yeah, Mary G. Welcome to the group. You said you were new, so I wanted to reach out and welcome you. So thank you all for being here today. I know these keep getting longer. I swear I'm trying to keep them now by 9 o'clock my time. But I do appreciate your patience and hanging in there through all the questions and responses. And I wish you a very blessed week ahead. And as always, bid you Benum Christ in it and God.